Thank you, Brendan. Thank you to our keynote speakers. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce the first panel, from public interest design to humanitarian design. We're going to discuss in this panel about how design compels a more inclusive humanitarian response. We have some superstars sitting with us in the panel. I start from the left of the table, Sergio Pagliaroni, professor and director of the Center for Public Interest Design at Portland State University. Carmen Mendoza, from the Universitat Internacional de Catalunya, director of the Master in International Cooperation, Sustainable Emergency Architecture. Sean Anderson, associate curator of the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York. And to moderate the panel today, Maria Aquilino, president of Problem Wisdom and the editor of Beyond Shelter, Architecture and Human Dignity, a fantastic book that I recommend you to read. So please welcome them.
Thank you. Are we live? Can you hear us okay? Okay. The wonderful Gaelic philosopher Mark Rowlands once told me that, it's simple. For people to flourish, they need good choices, not just any choice. Good choices. Throughout the summit, we're going to be exploring the role of design in creating good choices, in helping people flourish, not simply flee. Alberto and Angela provided us, the panel, with a list of questions. They were vast, really intimidating questions. But the one that stopped me in my tracks wasn't on the list. It's the subtitle to the panel. Can design compel inclusion? Compel, not suggest, invite, explore, but compel. An urgent word. A word that kind of takes you right up front. And so I thought, I don't know. And then I started to get a little bit worried that, the answers weren't coming that simply. And I imagined kind of reforming the question just a little bit to say, but what if it's compel if? If we work to eliminate the barriers to collaborate. If we recognize the growing complexity of the work we're doing, even as funding is dribbling in. If we insert ourselves into the violence of supply chains, if we work toward common ground. Now, each of the panelists, they'll have their own list. That's my short list. They'll be taking up this problem of being compelled and how we can compel inclusion. They only have 10 minutes, so be nice to them, because that's not a lot of time. But what I really want to invite you to be is we have a lot of time for discussion. We're really fortunate for that today. This means we're here to work together. So what I would like to be thinking about as you're listening attentively to them is be bold. We need good questions today, not just, I'm here to moderate. This will be, the last time I have a lot to say about this. I'm here to encourage us to be bold with the way in which we participate together today. We are here today, in my view, as an act of common ground. We are that sliver of common ground today. So I invite you to use our time together to illuminate and hold this elusive terrain. I will now turn the presentations over to my panel. Thank you, Sean. Yeah. You can speak from here if you prefer, or you can take yourself up to this.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure and honor and very humbling to not only be the first presenter today after these extraordinary presentations, keynote presentations this morning, it's also quite daunting to be the first person to speak today with my incredible panelists and all of you. I thought because I would be first, I would present to you a kind of chronology of how my work as both an academic and now in the Museum of Modern Art has come to reach here and this conference and summit today. But before I do that, I wanted to thank Brendan and Alberto for the kind invitation to have me here. It's a great pleasure. So I'm going to start with a quotation. I was working in Australia for a few years, following a few years of working as an architect in Afghanistan and other locations. And I was asked by the university if I would make a kind of grant proposal, because I was told that my work, both in East Africa as well as in Afghanistan, was not Australian enough. And so I found this quotation. It was kind of embedded in a longer article on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. And for me, it struck me not only as an incredible form of violence, but also an odd, both social and ethical equivalence that with the body's fitness, both mentally and physically, there is, in fact, a kind of reciprocation that is diminished by space and through or by space, and by that then also potentially design and architecture. And this then began a research project to think about, to reframe, to question the very nature of space in the world today, both built and unbuilt, and how the spaces of border systems, the spaces of the landscape and the environment, the edges of our continents, and also the history of modernism are all complicit in some way and somehow reciprocating this question of ethics. So for Australia, at this moment in 2013 and 2014, the number of interceptions by the Australian Navy in international waters of boatloads of people coming into or trying to come into the country were at an unprecedented and an alarming rate, because many of these individuals were being either pushed away, very likely, or brought into the country only to be deposited in different islands that were then built specifically for holding people indefinitely. But there was a history here as well, not only in Australia, but also in the United States, in Italy, in Greece. These were histories of the camps that were being made either by people or for people, and fundamentally in places of today, like Al-Zatari and Al-Azraq, in the middle of the Sahara, the so-called jungle in Calais, and then Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. And a part of the research that I began then in Australia, because I was an American citizen, I was allowed to go to places like Manus Island, Christmas Island, and Nauru, the Pacific island nation of Nauru, because Australian journalists and government workers were not allowed to go to these places. These were places that were fundamentally erased, ignored, and made invisible. by virtue of a government that refused to acknowledge that the inhumane and inhuman conditions that were being forced on these people were also designed. And so one of my first trips to Manus Island, you're encountered in the middle of a very small island in the jungle with razor wire, with 18-foot high fences and impermanent structures and compound names that are taken from military names. In fact, then I started to find out a little bit more about these spaces. This, in fact, was an American prison during World War II that had been retrofitted, if you will, remade into an indefinite holding camp for up to 3,000 individuals, mainly men. And this is the state that I found it. You can see the Quonset Hut on the right, temporary quote-unquote caravans on the left, all surrounded by fencing, all inhabited by people, men, living in conditions like this. And I realized that as an architect and as a designer, working in the space of invisibility and working in landscapes that had not been documented and not been seen, the only way that one could potentially see them would be to allow for those individuals that were occupying these spaces to document them themselves, because journalists, of course, weren't allowed to do so. So working with a group out of Brisbane and out of Sydney, we began to sneak cell phones into these camps so that the individuals could actually take photographs and then share those photographs with individuals outside. And this is what we would see. These tents in a tropical climate were placed right on the edges of a salt marsh and of a sea in which saltwater crocodiles were very frequently coming up to the edges of these fences and threatening the individuals inside. Moreover, there were a number of murders, there were starvation, there was also an exclusion within this island and the nation itself. Even Papua New Guinea and its government refused to acknowledge that these spaces existed. And so to go to, very briefly, the island of Nauru, which in its heyday was the most wealthy nation per capita on the planet because of its phosphorus. It's an island of phosphorus. It's also the smallest nation on the planet. And when they ran out of phosphorus, they got into the business of keeping the detained individuals from Australia. And at the time was making $200 to $300 million a year to keep over 2,000 men, women, and children in this location that you see here. When they weren't being threatened by the wild dogs and the security contractors, they were also suffering in extremely deplorable conditions of tents and so-called tent shelters that were made for them. And these are my photographs then also not allowed. And then it led me to start to imagine what it means for these people to not only identify themselves as asylum seekers in this case, but also to be placed in a location that was so inhospitable to their being there that when they were driven around in these locked buses, for instance, in Manus Island as well as in Nauru, to see where they would live, basically. These were called culture tours. That locked bus became, for me, a kind of metaphor for the transits that these individuals had taken in order to reach a home that they might never see or experience. And over time, what we began to document were that architects were heavily involved with the building of new facilities on Christmas Island as well as on Manus Island, and these facilities are increasing day by day. And so too then began to expand, if you will, the palette of design and architectural elements that I became very interested in. The fact that as displaced individuals, the notion of architecture being both impermanent and permanent became a kind of crucible for trying to understand that architecture and our ideas about design are fundamentally, like our lives, always in transit. So here is a food deployment building in Dadaab. Here are the conditions in Dadaab on a rainy day. Which brings me to the museum. That's a slight diversion there, but I wanted to suggest perhaps with this image that the divisions that we see between individuals need not be there, that the us and them mentality of colonialism and post-colonialism, if you will, still exists, and it exists in a way that architecture and design can begin to mediate, hopefully. And that when I arrived in the museum, I was asked to make and propose an exhibition within 8 months, which is a new record, I would say, for the museum, to assert and to question the nature of space, the spaces of displacement in the world today. And the exhibition became Insecurities, Tracing Displacement and Shelter. Now, maybe a few of you might know that the Museum of Modern Art's legacy is actually based on two people, Alfred Barr and his wife, Margaret Scolari Barr, who were incredible fixtures of what would become the International Rescue Committee. In the 1930s and 40s, they led an effort to bring artists who were being persecuted in Germany and in Eastern Europe into New York, into the museum. And it's quite extraordinary to go to the archives and read the letters that they were sending on behalf of artists like Mondrian and others. And so this exhibition was not to propose any solutions, but in fact to question the nature of why we ask for and demand solutions. And I will go through this very briefly, but for me it was also incredibly important to articulate that architecture, design, and art can be seen together in responding to the crises that we are all facing today. So in this first instance, I show you on the left-hand side is one of the images from Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother series, but this is the only image in which the tent in which she and her family lived. On the floor is a work by the Korean artist Do Ho-soo, and it's in fact made out of very small people. So the notion of wiping your feet on a welcome mat is quite subversive. And then what one critic remarked as the smallest but most valuable object in the exhibition is on the pedestal, which is the Médecins Sans Frontières arm circumference bracelet, which is part of our collection, luckily. And this is the bracelet that is used to measure malnourishment, even at this moment, upon entry into a displaced context. A little bit further, then you see on your left the IKEA Better Shelter, which came into our collection on behalf of IKEA Foundation, but also the museum, not necessarily as an indication of excellent design or incredible design, but perhaps as critical design. because at this moment, or at that moment, I should say, IKEA was working very hard to create a product, and I use that word from them, a product that would be used in displaced contexts. Unfortunately, what we've seen with this product is that it's often used for offices and not for shelters. And then the works of Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman, thinking of border systems, especially our southern border. This is a very large work that looks at the ways in which housing and architecture in particular 50 miles north of the border and 50 miles south of the border are completely and at times at odds with the notion of what housing is and can be. A work that I'm very proud to say became the first work by African artists in the collection of Department of Architecture and Design. This is a work that I commissioned with the help of many women in Western Sahara. If you know, Western Sahara is fundamentally a state of displacement. And this is a very large textile work in which I had asked them, the community, to make a map of themselves. And so this is what they made. It's a very large woven tapestry. And you can see that they've located, in fact, in their more than 50 years of displacement, all of the ministries that they feel are central to who they are. And the biggest surprise was, in fact, the museum, which does exist in Western Sahara, in Sarawi. And the museum is a one-room building in which they have documented over the years, the bombings, the war that has led them to this permanent state of displacement. Two further works on the floor is a section of a work by the refugee artist Tiffany Chun, who herself and her family left Vietnam, arrived in Hong Kong, were detained for many years on an island in Hong Kong before making their way to the US. And above is an image of Dadaab by Brendan Bannon. The largest work, perhaps, and the one that frames both the exhibition and our thinking, was this installation by the Indian artist Rena Qalaat. This is a work that is site-specific in as much as time-specific. And it's made out of the recomposition of electrical and telephone wires that are then sewn onto the wall as a map. And what you can start to see is that our geography, our world that we know today, is actually not that which we are defined by borders, not that which we define by architecture, but by flows, by movements, by transits of people, by invisible transits of money across borders and across continents. And so she very delicately starts to remake these electrical wires into barbed wire, that those pathways that you see are crisscrossing the planet and then also being unmade and made. And then outside of the gallery was a blown up, enlarged spreadsheet called the List of Deaths. And the List of Deaths is an ongoing spreadsheet made and comprised by over 400 organizations across the world, located or centered, I should say, in the Netherlands. And here you sometimes have names, but more often not, of all the individuals that are found who have perished in transit.
2 minutes, please, Sean.
I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge where we are today, all of us. And as the first person to speak, I feel it's my responsibility to say that this is not architecture, and this is not design, yet it is. And there are people who are responsible for building, maintaining, and preserving these systems that are happening right now in our southern border. Buildings like this, this was the front page of the New York Times. So what I'd like to conclude with, to come back to perhaps the museum, which may be one of the last spaces according to, or thinking about where we are right now, is that when we look through and by design and architecture, perhaps this used to be a door of no return. So too is this becoming a door of no return. And I think we, as a group, have a responsibility and a capability of stopping that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I also want to start by thanking this incredible summit. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Alberto and Angela and everybody that's organizing. I think it's very necessary, as we just heard. And what I'm going to share with you today is the experience we've acquired for the past 10 years through a singular master's, which, as I'll explain, it's the Master of International Cooperation, Sustainable Emergency Architecture. And what I'm going to share with you is the work we're doing in the master's with professionals that are from the built environment in general, geography, and we have students from geography, from engineering, from architecture, urbanism, but also the research that we're developing. I think this is maybe more interesting for you. To see how this is leading to a line of thought and methodology that then is trying to do research in the fields that I'll just explain very briefly here. The overview of the masters, we are working in post-disaster and post-conflict situations. So they're people from the built environment, but they're getting an interdisciplinary perspective because of the complexity where we're working, as we all know and we've all heard here today. So we're trying to see emergency architecture and sustainable urban development together, and going also from an interscalar approach, which I think is very singular, because in architecture in Spain, there is no planning as a career. So architects are also doing urbanism and planning, so we can never leave the urban scale when we're working. And this is the first singularity. So it's from shelter to settlement, reconstruction, we're talking about in post-disaster, and in post-conflict situations, understanding everything that is behind it, like a vast knowledge that we have to know in order to go on the field, like climate change adaptation, environmental justice, political ecology, et cetera. And it's very context-based. I think this is something we all agree on, and I'll try to share. So design is not the final objective, but the process of the design, which has to be approached in a collaborative way. This is what we believe in which the different parties, whenever we go into a project, it's the government, the private organizations, the NGOs, and the citizens. They all have their own roles and responsibilities. So when we're talking about interdisciplinary, it's not that we stop being architects and don't talk about the physical, but in a different perspective, no? So we think it's very, very important that we understand that architecture has to have a cultural attachment to the place, as well as in the reconstruction process, or if we're working in upgrading and development. So our objective in our research group and what we're doing is that we strongly believe in breaking the traditional silo in which the physical and the social layers of a place are not linked. I think this is something that our main objective is create this seamless approach to research, which in architecture schools sometimes is not approached, and we see that when we get our students. It's to provide a methodological approach which synthesizes the physical and active community manifestations in the urban space. We are always working at an urban scale to begin with, and then we have another part where we're developing more low technology construction and shelter. But basically, I'm going to explain what we're doing from the urban perspective. So in order to do so, we incorporate tools that combine bottom-up participatory mapping of the social spatial traits of the settlements in which we work, be it in any context, with top-down technical urban design tools, such as community mapping, as you see here, or also how we transform these qualitative and social inputs to the design process. So it's creating a guide to physical interventions. Here you see some examples of what I'm talking about in the project. Some of the slides are in Spanish because we're working a lot also in our context in Europe and Latin America too. For this, we believe it is necessary to transmit to our students that the creative contribution of the built environment professionals is vital. So we don't want us to become sociologists all of a sudden, but see that it is impossible to stand out, that creativity is not confined to only visual concerns. It is about innovative insight, making a lot from a little, lateral thinking, and imagining something radically different. That's what we understand as creativity when we're working. So creativity is usually very top-down, an approach that is not very successful, but processes need to be organized bottom-up and compromises made where people are part of the system. We really believe that if architecture can get involved in the everyday, we will be more effective in the extraordinary day when a crisis occurs. So the further we are from the people, I think is when our career really is not giving much and is isolating itself. So when it comes to post-conflict situations, and this is where part of our research is being developed, and how are architects or urbanists dealing with refugees or displaced populations, one of our main concerns is that we've been talking a lot of camps, we've been working a lot of bettering camps, but we really believe that we have to stop, because by doing this, we're perpetuating a state of exception, which are camps. And we're playing along with the European governments or governments all over the world, and what we're trying to do is keep the refugees out, making them a permanent exception solution through camp design, through camp maintenance, as you were saying. So we really believe that we have to take a stand, and we have to think in options that are more an urban integration of refugees. So in this sense, we cannot accept camps as a form of urbanization, I think, because then we're putting them as a state of a way of living, no? And we all know that it's not benefiting anybody. It's creating ghettos in all the world. And basically, we're perpetuating and helping political, ideological stand, especially in Europe and all the treaties that are going on, no? So I think I can contribute to this perspective through our experience in the European context, this very bad slide, sorry, in which the main problem still is the lack of physical and social integration strategies and policies for urban refugees. The issue of preparedness of the host countries, as well as the integration of newcomers into society, is becoming a core issue for all European cities. There is a need of integrated strategies, no, and with a sustainable way, preventing the conflicts and especially the perception that refugees are a social burden and economic burden, and give a voice to all stakeholders. That means also the host communities have to participate. We really believe we have to avoid the idea of new marginal spaces where we're hosting refugees in many European cities. It is very important to overcome this emergency approach because we're talking about a permanent situation. So how do we make this a model which is sustainable, integrated from the physical, social, and economic perspective? So this is basically what we've been working on. Working in a city like Barcelona, which is self-proclaimed a refugee city. As of 2015, the city is developing a protocol that is very advanced in the sense that it's not only talking about the preparedness, but also the implementation and the follow-up through social organizations from the municipal government. So in a way, we're in a privileged situation here, although there are no refugees in Spain, because as you know, till recently there's been a change of government, and now for the first time, Spain is opening its borders for refugees due to the crisis of the Atlantis boat. So we're working, though, from a municipal level with them through their, oops, I did what I didn't have to do. What did I touch? Yes. Uh-oh. You warned me. I use my hands too much. So as I was saying, the mayor has created an office of, that is called Refugee City. And Rena Qalaat was an activist, so she's really moved into the reception of refugees in the city. And what we're doing is an assessment of how to do an integration from an urban scale. We're talking about temporary housing, and this is what we've been analyzing. When we saw this at the urban sphere, there's a need to shift from urban governance and planning, because traditionally urban planning is mostly related to the top-down and long-term normative framing of land use, specifically in Spain. However, there's a raising awareness that a more adapted approach about land use regulations has to be adopted, which should be flexible in order to respond to immediate stresses such as the ones we're evidencing through immigration waves and refugees. Therefore, from a physical and integration perspective, there's need to be connected to the neighborhoods and create an identity with this new urban space. It seems reasonable to expect that housing refugees by the reuse of an existing building, and this is what we're working on, is a easy way to integrate into the urban fabric. Adaptive reuse of existing buildings can also promote greater social equity within an urban place, as opposed to new housing built away from any urban fabric. On the other hand, in order to be socially inclusive, we also need to build social infrastructure. So here you can see some maps of how in this temporary housing that we're analyzing, the people are using the neighborhood, the services, and also working with the host communities and the NGOs that are involved. So we really believe that the proper access to the resources is a key factor for the refugee integration. That's why we're advocating for the urban scale. And place attachment, it's traditionally shown that it can be, and it can play a role in the construction of an identity that challenges the stigma, because this is one of the problems that they're facing. It provides a sense of security, and it's been proven through examples against processes of neighborhood disinvestment and abandonment. So this is another perspective we were analyzing. And finally, is the physical integration and social integration can mean a variety of things for different cultures, and this is what's happening with the refugee influx that we're having now in the city. Therefore, the adaptation has to incorporate the host communities. This is something that is going in parallel to the physical assessment, which is incorporating different disciplines such as anthropologists, even psychologists, because it's not just the trauma of the moment when the crisis they're in, but it's also the journey. As you were explaining before, the journey is terrible, and also the reception. So it has to incorporate the culture, and this is something that's why we introduce interdisciplinary perspectives, and also gender, because when the roles change very much in refugees when they arrive in the country, so there's a big change in roles and gender, which we also want to incorporate in the process. So it's also incorporating different disciplines, it's incorporating different discourses that as architects we're not used to, so we don't have to be just intervening from a physical perspective, but also incorporating all these voices, So finally, to end, a good friend of ours and a professor at our master's, Nabil Hamdi, said that in order to educate built environment professionals to be more aware of how to be enablers and how to engage with people in order to understand the process, there needs to be a shift away from personal award to creating positive impact through collaborations. And research and training has to have all at its core a commitment to knowledge co-production, and this is something that we're trying to see how to function through these projects. And finally, the humanitarian field would benefit a lot from a design practice that is seen as an expanding field rather than being developed in isolation, which tends to happen. And engagement and situated practice is the key for the ethical approach to research and practice develop. We can go further on to see and discuss more of this. I just wanted to give you a brief example of how we're working, trying to avoid the creation of camps, which is still happening. As you know, the European Union now is hiring private companies to develop the plans, so it's becoming a big business, but at the same time, they're hiring in the waters in the Mediterranean Ocean and Sea especially, Frontex as a private company that is rescuing refugees and then taking them directly to camps. So I totally agree with what you were saying before, that I think if we have to talk about something, is thinking of an alternative to camps, and especially taking a stand and not perpetuating this state of exception. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So I have the distinct advantage of coming in last, so all the groundwork has been laid out, so I'm going to abbreviate part of what I was even going to say, which I was trying to be a brief, because I know Marie from collaborating on the book, but also I teach in this program in Europe, which is actually extraordinary because it stands out as a kind of the only program actually preparing people for this field, which is extraordinary that even saying that, and the average class is what, 25 people, and so the bottleneck is huge. So I hope if I could conscribe you all, then you would double the number of people who are being trained. So so my field is interesting because in Sean and here in Carmen, a lot of the groundwork has been set up. I started in the field, and before I became director of this center, which is actually is a think tank within the Oregon University system, I was a practitioner, and I spent my first 10 years working for the UN and the World Bank in emergency situations, and started in the Western Sahara, in the Policial, and in the early 80s. And so I actually, so the way I got into this was actually backwards. It maybe because I got to the field and realized I had no real training to do what I was being asked to do, even though I was commended as being a very good architecture student. So I realized madly, as I began to try to remember my anthropology classes at Berkeley, and trying to figure out what all these people had told me and all the things that really weren't incorporated into my education, that I became aware that there was just no, that all these beautiful practices and ability to draw and everything like that was only maybe 20% of what I needed to know. So a group of us, about 30 some of us who had worked in the UN and in the World Bank, and in our last project in the reconstruction of Mexico City in Fase 2, decided that we were going to spin off, and we decided we have to go back and rethink the education of architects and other designers so that we can actually deal with these issues which are looming but hidden and never appear in magazines or things like that. So I created this center. I came from University of Texas with the promise that we would be this endowment to create this center, which was great, that Oregon decided to take this initiative in the kind of social, kind of progressive side of Oregon. And the center really is actually, does a range of different things, and it provides the first degree in America as in public design, a graduate degree, and now we're starting a doctorate starting this next year. But the idea is that you spend a third of the time in the field, a third of the time working with a mentor like Nabil, who is a professor of mine, and a third time in coursework. And when you get out, you maybe have better skills and abilities than the ones we do. But at the core of it is actually this kind of emerging idea that I've had the pleasure for the last 30 years of being, this evolving idea of what is public interest design, which is this field which is changing the logic of what design, the role that we as designers play, and has led me now to a statement which I've been quoted a lot in, Brian Bell, everybody's quoted, which I say typically that 90% of what we do you never see in the building that gets built. In other words, all the human relations, all the capacity building, all the assessment of what the assets, all the work with the communities, all the kind of deep conversations you have, which lead to the programming, and then figuring out how you're going to pay for it and how it's going to be implemented and how it's going to affect the most lives possible. And so I'm going to shorten my presentation and I'm going to take a certain liberty that Alberto somewhere, who is my former student and will someday much more brilliant than me, will tell you. So I've done a lot of international work, and that's what I'm renowned for. But and so I'm going to start with an international project, and then I'm going to buck what he asked me to do, and I'm going to show you a national project, because I think the boundaries of where refugees, disaster relief, and everything else is happening, as Sean has said, is actually happening within our own roof and within our own country. So this project is actually just to show you the kind of work we do, in which we try to, I set them out, reframe the problem in terms of the needs and understanding the community happens in southern Buenos Aires, and I grew up in Patagonia. I hate Buenos Aires, but because of the other part of the thing, but except when my heart gets broken, like yesterday when we get slaughtered by the Croatians. But this is the part of Buenos Aires that you do not see. This is southern Buenos Aires. And Buenos Aires, if you think of it as an apple, has a northern part of Buenos Aires, which is Paris, and the southern part of Buenos Aires, which could be the Delta of Niger or anywhere in the world. So, and the poverty there is extraordinary. And the situations, it suffers the riachuelo, the water system goes through it. It's been labeled by the UN as one of the 4 or 5 most contaminated waterways on Earth. And many years ago, in a lapse of insanity, the World Bank gave it the largest grant in history to remedy that. And throwing that kind of money into Argentina is always a problem. And it sat there for a long time without be able to be implemented. And eventually, I was invited there by some insane minister of development, and we went there and we went to the communities and tried to see how the water was impacting. So rather than looking at it as a meta project, we went onto the community and looked at how it was impacting the community. And we looked at it at many different scales, from interviews to the impact it was having on how people were developing land, which is basically a squatter community in the South, to even having ways of monitoring it. This was in collaboration with MIT, from where I graduated, and looking at distant prospecting and how people could look at it from a distance. And what we came up with is really, this is one of several maps, logic maps. This is what it would take to implement the World Bank loan in Buenos Aires. And if you look at it, then you begin to realize that, yes, it's unimplementable because the legal system and the economic system, which is never going to actually make it possible to do it. So the logic of a bottom-up seemed necessary. So we were allowed to take one part of it and of that $14 billion and work with 3 different communities in the South and create a kind of participatory process which created a body of knowledge of how it's affecting humans, and working with schools of medicine, Johns Hopkins and Oregon, et cetera. We were able to look at the public health outcomes of it and see how it's specifically implemented. And these people are sitting around and actually spending the week going through their assessment of how it's impacting their environment. And out of that came a kind of strategic mapping process, and this is like the planning document for 3 years of implementation of, okay, we have this knowledge, how do we implement it? And how do we implement it so in the end, we all gain a kind of collective knowledge of how this affects us, because knowledge means that the project or the capacities they have built will outlive the 3 years of maybe implementing a solution, a local solution. And one of the outcomes, for instance, is this. We started to put public space, and this is one of 12 sheets of public spaces that were created, in which strategically public space, which never exists in squatter communities and informal settlements. And this is 3.5 million people who are displaced here, mainly from Andean countries, coming into Argentina because Argentina has a free health care system and education, and coming in for opportunity. And so economic and violence and everything is driving them in migration. Here, we're beginning to put places where they can get educated, where they can meet, they can health clinics, a health clinic for every indigenous group, for the Bolivians, for the Colombians, because it has to be culturally based. An important thing that came out, the discussion of why they weren't going to clinics in the first place. and then figuring out exactly how that investment, strategic investment, into public spaces would then create, how the investment creates public consciousness and inclusion into the system. So in the end, we created 12 water filtration systems, but really what we did created is the sense that in these communities, which represent about 310,000 people, that every one of those began to feel like they were part of the country in which they were going to become displaced. And so we would think of this as a kind of co-production, not the kind of top thing that we were thinking, but a co-production of a solution. And this is one of the things that came out of it. Of course, in that map, if you read a little fine print, were these economic incubators where people you might be making saddlebags or whatever in your home. The government would start creating these incubators where you could get $3,000 a month for a year and amplify your business and have a bigger impact. And surprisingly, a number of industries have come out of that last 10 years. So I'm going to jump over a project that Carmen was part of it, which is Chamanga, the northwest coast of Ecuador, which was devastated by a massive earthquake. Had so much nice things to tell you about it, but because I wanted this to be a conversation, we built a community center there, but we did a massive planning process for the UN, and in which Carmen's group participated. Did I get myself ahead? Okay. And this is a map of that planning process. And my whole point of that was that we went through the whole planning process. It was sponsored by UN. We made it part of the Habitat 3 conference so that it became part of 2 dialogues of the Habitat 3 conference. And what was interesting about it, I'm just going to conclusion before I go into the real final thing I'm going to show you, was that the planning process came up with something that everybody bought into. But when it became implemented, the will of the national government and the local governments and everything like that collapsed, and it's become a free-for-all for capital-driven development. And so the one strategic decision we made to build ourselves these community centers, I'm going to go back, is really what's in the end going to carry over that consensus that we reached through the process. So sometimes that's how you get in there. So I'm going to show you finally this effort, and it frames all sorts of things that I think the conference is dealing with, which is that in America, we have a lot of homeless people, or what we term or have been taught by the people on the street is houselessness, because they know what home is, they just don't have a house. So, and it's called the POT Initiative because people organize around this, dwelling, okay? And what we've done, we were asked by the mayors of Portland and Sacramento and things like that to come in. They had Oregon declared an emergency in terms of houselessness in 2016. A state of emergency because the people are in the street, it was affecting the public health, their health was going to hell and everything like that. And so when we entered this, we went to the encampments themselves. And this is an encampment, a self-organized homeless village, houseless village. And this is Hazelnut Grove, an extraordinary one. They have a mayor, in which I don't think I have a photograph of the mayor. And influenced by the Occupy Wall Street movement, the homeless in the West Coast have organized themselves into extended or what I would call deep democratic institutions of participatory democracy, working outside the system. And here you're having a meeting, and every one of these people represents a community of about 200 houseless people, sometimes more. And one of my colleagues, the guy with glasses on the left eye, and the city representative, the guy with the curly hair who's now in New York City, are there, and we are there only to hear and listen and to begin to understand the problem. And out of it came a participatory process. There's a diagram. You have to diagram everything because not everybody can read this long, wordy treatise. And then really what we did is said, let's co-opt the architecture and design community and bring them in and get them in to do what they were taught to do. And so here we had 100 homeless people, top firms like ZGF and Skylab, 40 under 40 groups and everything from the Northwest, in down with the houseless. And we just said, we have found that as whole in the permitting process, that if you keep a house under 225 square feet, we can get it non-permitted as long as we meet certain requirements. And so they came up with a series of solutions. This is by SRG, a very important partnership, which is made of little trusses going around, which allow for storage. And the solution itself is beautiful. You know, here people studying, how can you get a living, sleeping, socializing space in such a small space? But the interesting thing about it is that it turned the logic of what we thought is an intractable problem, and of course it is intractable because the federal government has essentially given up on public housing, but it figured out a way that a small entity like a city government, which is already stressed by all the demands that the federal government is passing on to, can take on something as a distributed solution. And so we set up at warehouses at Christmas, and we built tons of them. You can see different designs that came out of it. But also, we created a political process by which each of these groups of housing went out to communities. We reached out to the 90-some neighborhoods in Portland, which became our pilot case. And we met this lady as the head of the community, the Kenton Women's Neighborhood, and she's sitting down with the young designers and trying to figure out, okay, and houseless people, and figuring out, well, what would it mean to have a houseless village in my community, and try to overcome that and try to figure out how could that become an asset to the existing community. And people they might support the homeless, but they feel anxiety about having the homeless living among them. So we decided strategically that the first one that we should address is women, because homelessness among women leads to about almost 70% mental issues, kind of psychological issues, because being homeless as a woman is the worst possible condition, and they're the most marginalized, impacted group. So we decided to start with women, and now we're working with veterans. And here we're having the public meeting with Mayor Wheeler going through. It's the first. The city has opened its kind of warehouse land all over the city, which is not used for other purposes. This is becoming the first one of them. The cost about $2,600 per unit. We all common facilities that are shipping containers, so they're more durable, so they can be displaced. We are only sitting temporarily at temporary permit. And here, the community that we worked with, Kenton and now 3 others, are out there helping to create with the community at the end the gardens and everything else that would make a community. So the reason I mentioned this, so here we are, opening day, people are coming, they're opening their houses up, and this is just taken a couple of weeks ago, and show you people have decorated, etc. We've been on the ground 16 months, and 22 women have gone through the first 14 units. We have 56 units now, 3 villages that are going up. What's interesting is working with Catholic Relief Services, we have transitioned 2 generations of people through this houselessness, out of homelessness, and into permanent situations. So sometimes a strategic decision like that can create a huge impact, because this condition of being homeless accentuates and multiplies itself to a point where people fall out of the system. So the key issue is, how do we bring them back into the system? How do we connect them with us as normal people? And how do, out of that relationship, begin to then build them back into our society, because we have the capacity. I was just thinking about the refugee camp that we were talking about, you were showing in the border, and part of that New York Times article was saying that they paid $1.5 billion for those people to be refugees. And I think I can build 110,000 of these houses for that price. And provide for all the services. I was doing the math. That's why I was doing the math. The second generation is being supported by the veterans in the United States. We're taking actually building units. They're being taught how to build them. We have set up a warehouse, and they've already built 2 other villages. So these people need the capacities and inclusion to become back part of society. So, and I think that that's one of the things that public interest design, this is our logic map of how that gets, it's tracking. We always do these, the little line inside shows all the public meetings and resolutions and the product being developed. And so I'm going to end very quickly here with just things I threw out at 6:30 this morning, and they're no order. But I think that the observations, but I think that one thing that I was going to say is that something that's extraordinary is that, I used to send my students outside the country because I was training them for international relief and construction, and because I wanted American students to become aware of the rest of the world. I said, we dominate the world, yet we have no understanding of the rest of the world. So I would send them out to Africa, Mexico, places like this, and go work with them in the planning, design, et cetera process. I realized I can just send them across the block and get the same experience properly constructed. Poverty is here, crisis is in the United States as well. So, and what to me is the most difficult, and I see worldwide happening, is the kind of sense that people are losing their faith in the institutions and political processes that we have, and losing the kind of consensus that is needed to actually support these things to happen. The money's there to make the change. It's just our consensus and ability to come together as a country to support these things is what's missing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to my wonderful panelists. We ran a little bit long, but it was too exciting to get in the way, and which means I'm more than happy. I promised you, and I asked you to be bold, and I'm more than happy to, cede my time to you so we can really have a discussion about the issues that were raised. And I'll review a few of them. Some I'm sure you have your own particular questions in mind, but just to remind you of where we started, architecture as a form of holding and then making people invisible. The fact of, can we really, Carmen, has just put it right out there today. There are lots of panels. We're discussing camps and the refugee system. And can we really continue to do this? Is that what we're asking our design skills, insights, and incentives to be focused on? Making camps better. What kind of decision is it ultimately? It's clearly not one that we can correct in just a few hours of discussion, but we really need to take it on head on. And then I think Sergio makes the case that we really need to understand that it's not a building necessarily, right? It's not always a building. Designing strategies, designing opportunities for inclusion, designing questions around how it is that we have and invite voices to be heard, and not just in a peripheral sense, really as part of ongoing processes and mechanisms that we're repeating and using again and again. It's not to say that, I always tell my students, sit on your hands and don't design anything, right? Just wait a few minutes, right? Because we're really, really happy to get in there. We do it well, and maybe that's kind of the problem a little bit. We do it so well, so that it looks, it's just fantastic, but it actually has nothing to do with meeting the realities, that we're faced with. So I would very much encourage you to jump in with your questions, and let's get started. Yes, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tiffany Chun. I'm a researcher and a Ph.D. student in Universitat de Montréal. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm working on space appropriation, the case of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And you talked about camps, and that we should stop talking about camps, improving camps, designing camps. And I totally agree, but I would just like to ask you a question. Do you think that spatial exclusion is the only form of exclusion? Lebanon has been praised for adopting a non-encampment policy. However, given the precarious situation in the country and given the fact that humanitarian funding has decreased, Lebanon is doing the government is doing what the government knows how to do, is exclude refugees institutionally, economically, and socially. And this is another form of spatial exclusion. So my question is, camps or no camps in this case? Thank you.
Carmen, would you like to?
Yes, is it on? How do I turn it?
Yeah, you're good.
You can hear me, right? Yes, definitely. It's when I'm talking about the camps, like we were seeing Zaatari camp or Azraq, and I was criticizing more the position we have sometimes of just assuming this as the solution. I know that in Lebanon, Dar el Bared, no, is basically an informal settlement now, no, because it was recreated and redone with the help of the refugees, and it's a political situation actually. You know, I think that's when I was saying that when we're teaching not just how to design well or methodologies that are social and spatial, as I was explaining, but also understanding the context, because I know it's good to say we're apolitical, but we're not. Everybody has a political stand. And I think that when we're teaching in our schools, we have to have this reality out there, because or else we do really obvious mistakes that we've all done. And when we started working in this program, we were working away from Europe, because unfortunately now the refugee situation has gotten to our doorsteps. And what I was showing a bit was an alternative that has been assumed, and there's a government behind it, a local government behind it, that is thinking of this perspective of, okay, no, we have to do a real integration, because there is being a lot of reuse strategies in Germany, for example, right now. But it has to be accompanied with a program that is, with an introduction to the culture, to the language. So this is where our interdisciplinarity starts. So we're putting together a protocol which is done in a long time with the host communities, with the academics that are there, with the NGOs that are there, because we have to assume that we can't just do physical solutions, you know. So that's where I was going to, but I totally agree that even if there are integration, quote unquote, in certain countries, it's not working because it's very political, and it's a spatial segregation that is voluntary. And I think what worries us, and we're in this conundrum, no, what do we do? Do we better the life of people that are in the camps because we have the opportunity to do schools, and many of our teachers are doing this actually on the field with many of the NGOs that are working there. But on the other hand, we have to speak up and say, you know, we're playing along with this policies of leaving everything out of our doors, no? And this is something that I can acknowledge, well, it's happening in Europe. I know it's happening all over the world, but this is where we're working. So this is what I wanted to bring to the table of discussion. Thanks. Have I answered? No.
Anyone else would like to comment on the question?
Sean, yeah. It seemed like it was directed at you originally.
Well, potentially. You know, I would say that the words that we hear quite often, or the language that's used quite often in these contexts, are either system or process, right? Mm-hmm. So Sergio and Monica spoke very eloquently about process, right? And what is really intriguing to me now, after looking at universities and degree programs and students who are quite often asking us to respond to these questions, is that the process of making and the process of conceptualizing the systems for the improvement or the efficacy of architecture for the displaced in all contexts is changing. And I think perhaps that with more emphasis and more kind of consideration, both from the top down and the bottom up, about what it means to have a process and to make it as flexible as possible, on one hand, is incredibly valuable. And then on the other hand, to think about what that system or systems start to encourage or discourage, as the case may be, more often than not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sorry. I was going to say, you know, there's no such thing as a temporary refuge. I mean, in my whole experience, it's, right. You know, people become permanent to wherever they are. And warehousing people has this tremendous impact on the system at every level. I mean, including psychologically for people to know that there's another within your country that is not really in your country, and, you know, and what that speaks to you of any moral person in that country. And so, and you know, we were part of a really interesting experiment when I worked in Mexico for a decade, and it was, there were a lot of Guatemalan refugees there. They were coming into Mexico but not going to the United States. And they had been basically stuck in Chiapas and parts of the South, and it cost the Mexican government, I don't some astronomical amount of money. And so they asked us, well, they're not going to go away, so let's just figure out a way to make them here. And I went back to an evaluation that was done 4 years ago by the Organization of American States and other people that were doing, and we found that by year 3 of the program of actually making them and integrating them into the villages, the cost of integrating and offering housing and integrating them into the health system and everything like that was a fifth of the cost it cost them to warehouse them the decade before. So making them a productive part of our country is in every way a better solution. So.
Thank you. Other questions, please? Must be, yes.
Thank you very much. It's incredibly enlightening today. So I appreciate all your time, your effort, and the work that you've done over a very long period of time. My name is Susan Millsap, and I teach at Ohio State University, and I teach community-engaged design build. I'm an architect. And I'm currently working with a national movement for the street population in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And as you probably remember from the news not too long ago, there was a very large abandoned building filled with squatters. And a lot of family members simply, seeking shelter, as is often the case when you find yourself on the streets, you self-organize and you move into one of these abandoned buildings. And so I'm very interested in how we can actually identify the processes for working with the different local governments and identifying the many movimentos are actually in these abandoned buildings, but they're obviously being threatened on a daily basis. So I'm curious about how the political process you've gone through identifying the existing buildings and if they're occupiable, and then getting the political systems to be on board with housing these folks in these buildings that basically the government has now because the building owners have basically walked away from them. So Paulo is filled with these vacant buildings. So I'm simply interested in, you touched very briefly about moving the refugees or the houselessness into the infrastructure, the existing infrastructure. Can you just speak, this is a very lengthy kind of question, but can you just identify a little bit how that was kind of leveraged through the design process? Thank you.
Yes, as I explained before, we're in an initial stage of the project, but we're talking about reuse of facilities because obviously it's very difficult to get into the private market right now. Barcelona right now is experiencing a tourism boom that has triplicated, quadruplicated, quintuplicated the amount of what the land value is. So what we're working with is with the housing department, and it has to do with how the local government is organized in Catalunya and in the region of Catalonia, but specifically in Barcelona. And so what we're doing is strategies that is in parallel, as I was saying, working with anthropologists and sociologists, which are with the community and the host community and the refugees for the needs of these buildings, and assessing what are the neighborhood facilities that are already in place, as I showed in those maps, that they're using, and what are the services that are available. So it's a very strong municipal government. I think this is a big advantage we have, no? O sea, everything is, the land is public, everything that is services are public in Spain. And so that's why we're working with facilities which are being transformed. And what we've done is a map of GIS with also working with the Polytechnical University of Catalonia with their management, land management department. And we're conducting the social spatial mapping at the same time with the sociologists and anthropologists that are working in community stakeholder groups in order to see what are the necessities they have for the reuse. But the reuse strategy is economically more feasible, so we also have an economic assessment that is being done. And with this, we have the support of the municipal government, of this office that I told you about called Ciudad Refugi. And it's an office that is linked directly with the mayor of Barcelona. So we have a lot of political support in that sense. I think Sao Paulo is a totally different model. And it really is, the governance structure is very, very important. And I understand that that's why I said living in Barcelona, it's a privilege right now. We don't know how long it's going to last because there's elections next year. But so far, also a lot of, something that is interesting is that there's also a whole program on, I was talking to somebody before of our Airbnb. There's a whole program of a social rent. So they're working with renters and private people that want to give the opportunity for refugees, but through social housing, like affordable housing.
May I follow up with a question, Carmen?
Too long.
No, just for 1 second, I just have a question with regard to the people who are already in the neighborhood, right? You know, this is a huge issue because if we do have buildings that are abandoned or not used, it suggests already that we're in neighborhoods that are somewhat fragile. So, you know, how is it that we go about, you know, working with and integrating fragile neighbors? I'm seeing this in Paris every day. You know, where the immigrant, we're not taking a stand. We're not doing anything. You know, the city won't do it. The state won't do it. And so, you know, people who are coming to the city, and, you know, when they emptied out Calais, everybody from Calais came to Paris, you know, are coming to already fragile and sensitive neighborhoods. And they're not happy about it at all because, you know, they've worked very, very hard to stabilize, you know, their existence already. So I was wondering, you know, is that part of the process in thinking about this, the nature of fragility and how it is that we don't want to make people more fragile than they already are in the process?
Yeah, definitely. And the example I showed, San Andreu is one of the most active neighborhoods in Barcelona of a lot of different entities working with social issues. So it's actually an ideal place to be there. And even so, when we did the assessment, many people didn't know and weren't aware that this temporary housing was happening. So there's a lot of process that has to be done with NGOs. It's Red Cross in the case of Catalunya that is in charge of this, as in many parts of Europe. At the same time, 2 local NGOs that are working together with all the process of trying to get the refugees to be autonomous. This is the target, no? And trying for them to live in a neighborhood which has so many services that they can work with and that you can work with is our target from a physical perspective and urban perspective.
Thank you. Other questions, please? We don't have a lot of time, but I'll take it. Yes. In the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Debbie. I work with CARE as part of our humanitarian assistance team, and I just was curious to ask, you talked a lot about the design process. As part of humanitarians, one of the key things we have as part of our core humanitarian standards, sphere standards, is about assessing the needs of the beneficiaries, looking at it from what it is that they want, not what we think is best for them. So I'm curious to ask, within part of the process of things you're working on, how do you incorporate that? Do you do assessments? Do you work with the local NGOs where they've assessed the needs of the refugees? What are they saying they need in terms of their living and, I guess, part of the process you do?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sergio, why don't you take this one? You're a master at this. So please.
So assessing the needs from, and I just started, and Carmen's, of the needs of the community, coming from the community, I mean, it's always the process, of course, and so, and you know, it's actually, it's so true, because I'm hard-pressed to generalize any group of refugees we've worked with about their needs having a common basis. I mean, the needs can be so different, and so I think coming from the community up and figuring out what their needs are and how they operate successfully, so understanding what their most successful model of existence is, or coexistence, has always been kind of the basis of trying to then construct with them a kind of solution which would both support that and integrate them to the society, you know, which you need to do. So I think that's always been at the core. I remember that we were working with the Organization of American States and Save the Children with Yaqui mothers, single mothers. It's a huge phenomenon in the north of the border, north of Mexico, and you know, the way that they figured out how to maintain their culture and solve the problem then was actually essential, and I don't think I would have ever come up with it. And then we just began to figure out where were the points of entry in terms of economic opportunities, opportunities for integration into the general community, which they had been displaced into, et cetera. So I think that to me is always the most exciting part of a project. And it's hard for us as designers to think about it, but then I tell all my design students, and I have students from business and public health and everything, so I can't claim that. But they are, it's actually one of the most exciting moments where you can begin to identify, what makes the society work, because it also gives you a better understanding of the people you're going to be working with through the entire process. So I think that's, to me, is a crucial moment.
Alberto, we have to stop. I'm so sorry. I hope you'll... One more? One more. Okay, great. Make it a good one. Yes, please.
Oh, the pressure.
Now there's pressure. Now there's pressure.
Oh, man.
No, he's sitting down. Don't forget it.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. My name is Jeremy Gossett. I'm an architecture student at Kane University. You mentioned a lot about that temporary situations become permanent. So I'm very interested in modular housing and creating affordable housing for people. So I was wondering if you've thought of expandable housing that would work for, almost creating from a fixed mindset in a small space into a growth mindset in an expandable space. If that's something you've ever come across, I guess.
Yeah. And I should open up to everybody. We've looked at a lot of in modular construction over the years. We do certain kinds of building types, like we do schools, which we drop into communities in South America. We work with Planned Parenthood and clinics and schools that way. But modular can be deceptive, because I can think of almost in any country that I operate with refugees and things where I can get it more cheaply produced by local craftsmen from the ground up than I can through like centralized housing. And then that allows me to actually deconstruct the project. And we actually ascribe to this thing, I don't know if you, design for disassembly, which is like becoming an international movement. And so I require them always to design whatever we're going to build with it locally to be done that way, because you're right, every house, like a family, will grow and change and things like that. So that also becomes a challenge for modularity, because the modular building's gone, you're going to expand your house, then you're screwed. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can say words like that. But anyway, so I believe in the power of understanding the local culture, because people understand it and they can work within it. So I don't want to dissuade you from modular, but anyway. Yeah.
Please don't.
Yeah,
Please
no,
jump in.
I'll just quickly extend both your question as well as the previous comment and articulate that the notion that modularity as a thing, as a practice, is already practiced. It doesn't necessarily need to be designed. And in fact, communities and local craftspeople and so forth are always working typically in this fashion. So to extend the previous comment, to allow communities, to allow individuals and groups of individuals to design for themselves, what I would call self-fashioning, right? How we fashion ourselves, both with design and architecture, but also as communities, whether we're displaced or not, is incredibly valuable and important to think about.
Thank you. We'll have to stop. I'd like to thank again Brendan and Alberto and Angela for the wonderful welcome and my fabulous panel. And thank you so much for your patience and your question and your interest. Thank you.